Hi, I'm Peter J. Ray. Welcome to the program. Today's topic is George Washington Part 3. We stopped last time in early 1776. The American Army and the British Army had about a 6-month-long standoff since the Battle of Bunker Hill. And there was no fighting, but they were both prepared to fight. And then Henry Knox, this Boston bookseller, had a great idea to transport the cannons from Fort Ticonderoga to Boston. They were set up at Dorchester Heights and aimed at the British positions down below in Boston. And the British decided they needed to withdraw from Boston, and they communicated, and they did withdraw. So this was a great victory. Boston was liberated without a fight, at least not since Bunker Hill. And that happened in March of 1776. Okay. George Washington, now after they left, there were British Loyalists, people who had been supporting Great Britain thus far. Many of them, if they could, tried to make their way to Great Britain by ship or Canada, or in some cases to the Bahamas. My family bought property in the Bahamas that there had been a British Loyalist living there. And my mother's Canadian. Both her parents were from England. She was always sympathetic to the British Loyalists in the American Revolution. Anyway, George Washington wrote this about the Loyalists left behind in Boston. Quote, "Unhappy wretches, deluded mortals, would it not be good policy to grant a general amnesty and conquer these people by a generous forgiveness?" See, I love that. That's a wonderful, incredible statement, conquering people by forgiveness. In other words, win people over. That's something that I believe in. Another way of saying it is destroy your enemy by making him your friend. Washington continued, quote, "No man has a more perfect reliance on the all-wise and powerful dispensations of the Supreme Being than I have, nor thinks his aid more necessary." Washington, throughout the war, talked about how he turned to God for help, and he received a great deal of help from God. So, after the British left, they never came back to Boston. They'd had enough of those troublemakers in Boston. And then the question is, what was going to happen next? And Washington and the American leaders believed that the British would attack at New York City. And so the American Army started to travel on land to New York City, and they arrived in the summer of 1776. Now, not long after arriving, there was evidence that a bodyguard of George Washington, Thomas Hickey, had been part of a plot to assassinate Washington. He was arrested, tried, convicted, and executed. He was hung in front of 20,000 people in New York City. Thomas Hickey. Now, there's a legend also in June of 1776 that George Washington met with Betsy Ross, a Philadelphia seamstress who must have traveled to New York, and he asked her to sew an American flag, which had instead of the stars, the way they are now, in a circle in the blue field in the corner. Now, while the American Army was in New York City, the Continental Congress was meeting in Philadelphia. It's 5 o'clock. Don't you love the chimes? My grandmother's sister's husband made this clock for our family, Dale Hughes. Okay, it stopped. Anyway, the Continental Congress was in Philadelphia meeting, and the big debate at that time was whether to have a Declaration of Independence. Now, the war had been going on, for more than a year, but there were many hoping that there could be a reconciliation with Great Britain, and they didn't want to make the final break. And so there was a lot of debate about that topic. John Adams was the leader in saying, we have to do it. We should do it. We should make it official, and we really need to become an independent country so we can decide our own fate instead of being at the mercy of whatever the British whims. So anyway, the job of writing the Declaration of Independence, once the decision was made that it should be written, that was given to Thomas Jefferson, and he wrote that document, and it was released to the public in Philadelphia on July 4th, 1776. So that's our Independence Day that we celebrate every year. The news of this came to New York City, and the Declaration was read to the troops there in New York, and they were inspired. They were inspired to tear down a statue of British King George III, on a statue of him on a horse in New York City. This was unauthorized, and Washington was upset, and Washington deplored their, quote, want of order. So that statue was broken into pieces, melted, and remolded into bullets used in the war. Now, just for a little perspective, in 1776, London was a huge city, had 750,000 people. The biggest American city was Philadelphia with 34,000. You see, these numbers are real small. New York City had 22,000 people. Boston, 15,000. Charleston, South Carolina, 12,000. Americans had the highest standard of living in the world. How about that? And again, it was because of the fertile land in America, this very fertile soil, since the American Indian population hadn't really worked. They had farmed. Indians had hunted and farmed, but their farming had not really depleted the soil very much. Also in July in New York, Washington issued orders against the quote, the foolish and wicked practice of profane swearing. We can have but little hopes of the blessing of heaven on our arms if we insult it by our impiety and folly. Okay, so the British were coming again, and they arrived in July 1776 in New York City with 100 ships, 32,000 British troops. Ooh, wow. Now, during the war, there were 30,000 German mercenaries fighting for the British. And reportedly, most of the British soldiers were German. These, what they called Hessians, after the German state of Hesse. Those troops landed at Staten Island first, and then after establishing themselves there, they proceeded to Long Island and Gravesend and Brooklyn, and the Flatbush area in Brooklyn. And thus ensued the battle. The fighting started in New York City, and in August there were 500 Americans killed in New York City and Brooklyn on Long Island, 1,000 captured. Before that battle, Washington said to his troops, quote, "Remember, officers and soldiers, that you are free men fighting for the blessings of liberty." Okay, so things weren't going well. There were reports that the British soldiers were raping American women on Staten Island, and other reports that British soldiers were bayoneting American soldiers after they had surrendered, and that specifically Hessian soldiers were pushing Americans against trees with their bayonets and bayoneting them against trees. So, pretty bad. So, August 29th, the Americans were retreating from Long Island toward the East River, and they were blessed or lucky that there was a fog, because they were pinned against the East River on Long Island, and they were able to get across. 9,000 American troops were able to depart Brooklyn, cross the East River to Manhattan at night, and escape from the British. So this was a real blessing. But things were falling apart. After crossing the East River, the American Army slept for 24 hours. These guys were exhausted, and it started to dissolve. And there was a lot of desertion in Manhattan. The British invaded Manhattan at Kips Bay on September 15th and was preceded by a bombardment of American positions. The American soldiers panicked, and this became a disaster. And in this fighting at Kips Bay, Manhattan, Washington, you could say, lost his mind. He was so upset because the troops, they panicked, and because of this bombardment, and they retreated. They lost their nerve. And Washington himself had to be physically led away because he would have been captured. And it was close to a suicidal situation that he just was out of his mind with anger that the troops were not performing. Anyway, so after that, they retreated north to Harlem. The U.S. did have a victory at Harlem Heights. On September 19th, 1/4 of the city was set on fire, and there were a lot of desertions in the American Army. Also in September, Nathan Hale, who was a young man, 21 years old, he was a spy, an American spy, spying on the British, and he was captured and he was executed. He was hung. Before he was hung, he shouted, quote, "I only regret that I have but one life to lose for my country." It's another famous quote from American history. Anyway, by November, there was this Fort Washington, which fell to the British in, I believe, in Manhattan, and 3,000 American soldiers were captured. So in short, the Battle of New York was a terrible defeat, a total disaster for the United States. And the American Army retreated from New York City into New Jersey. In August, there had been 20,000 American troops. By November, there were 3,500. So either guys who had been killed, wounded, or captured, or deserted. Now, they retreated across New Jersey, and the British were following them. And as they followed, the British plundered New Jersey. There were reports that American women were being raped, homes looted and destroyed, and anyone who resisted was killed. And supposedly these German mercenaries were especially brutal, and there was a lot of outrage against the British. By December, the American Army crossed the Delaware River into Pennsylvania. And things looked very, very bad. In fact, it looked like the war was over. It really did. A lot of people thought, well, it's over. We lost. Now, once again, Thomas Paine, who had written that book, Common Sense, he came out with another short book called The Crisis. And this had a very positive effect on morale, because morale was at an all-time low. Here are some words from that book. Quote, "These are the times that try men's souls. The summer soldier and the sunshine patriot will in this crisis shrink from the service of their country. But he that stands it now deserves the love and thanks of man and woman. Tyranny like Hale is not easily conquered. Yet we have this consolation with us, that the harder the conflict, the more glorious the triumph. Heaven knows how to put a proper price upon its goods. And it would be strange indeed if so celestial an article as freedom should not be highly rated." So this had a very positive effect on morale. And, those famous words, "These are the times that try men's souls." In December, American General Charles Lee was captured by the British in New Jersey during the retreat. And in a way, it was a blessing because Lee was scheming to replace George Washington as the commanding general. Among all the problems Washington faced, one of them was the politics, that people thought, he's no good, he's a bad leader, look at all this, we lost New York City, terrible. So there were, and other guys who wanted to take over, and there was a lot of political infighting which added to his troubles. But he retained the confidence of the Continental Congress, or at least enough of it. And in December, he was given unlimited power, or dictatorial power, to handle the crisis that he faced. And he responded. George Washington said, quote, "Instead of thinking myself freed from all civil obligations by this mark of their confidence, I shall constantly bear in mind that as the sword was the last resort for the preservation of our liberties. So it ought to be the first thing laid aside when those liberties are firmly established. Now you see, he's alluding here to the idea that military authority must be under civil authority, which is a hallmark of American life. So Washington, they'd crossed into Pennsylvania, the American Army. They were close to the Delaware River, and a lot of guys thought the war was over. Washington didn't. He thought he knew he had to do something. He had to figure out what he could do. And so he came up with a plan. And this is where we come to the famous painting, Washington Crossing the Delaware. Washington Crossing the Delaware. Very inspiring painting. And actually it was the recrossing of the Delaware River. Washington decided to attack the British Army base at Trenton, New Jersey. So the American soldiers, they got on these boats and recrossed the Delaware River, and it was very icy, and there were large pieces of ice in the water. Some of the ships couldn't make it because the river had frozen. They couldn't navigate. And they started this at night, on Christmas Day night, and they crossed the river and they marched all night to Trenton, New Jersey. And these guys, they were hungry. It was actually around freezing, the temperature, so it was muddy. They were slipping and falling down. They were cold and dirty and hungry. And by the time they had got to Trenton, shortly after dawn, they were covered in mud and out of their minds with fatigue and hunger and pain and so forth. And they started screaming when they entered Trenton. And there was some fighting, but not a great deal, because this was an unexpected attack, and it was a great victory. A great American victory. And this was the turning point in the war. This is why that painting, Washington Crossing the Delaware, is so famous. 1,000 Hessian soldiers were taken prisoner, 150 were killed and wounded, and a lot of weapons were captured. See, they needed muskets, these guns and so forth, and ammunition and gunpowder. So it was a turning point in the war. James Monroe was a young fella, young guy in the American Army, and he was shot in an artery and nearly bled to death. Fortunately, someone was able to stop the bleeding. Otherwise, he would have died. He could have died, and that was very good, because he became the 5th U.S. president, James Monroe, and he was a great president. So this was wonderful. Now, and Washington followed this up with an attack on Princeton, New Jersey, in January of 1777, and that was another victory as well. So these two battles of Trenton and Princeton, New Jersey, had a very positive effect on the morale of the American Army and the cause for independence. Now Washington had this problem of many of the soldiers, their enlistments coming to an end at the end of December, so he gave another speech to these men, because otherwise the army was going to dissolve. And this is what he said, quote, "My brave fellows, you have done all I asked you to do, and more than could be reasonably expected. You have worn yourselves out with fatigue and hardships, but we know not how to spare you. If you will consent to stay 1 month longer," see, he's asking for just 1 month, "you will render that service to the cause of liberty and to your country which you probably never can do under any other circumstances." And so that was, again, it convinced enough guys to re-enlist, and the Army continued. One officer had this to say about George Washington after the Battle of Princeton, quote, "I shall never forget what I felt when I saw him brave all the dangers of the field, and his important life hanging as it were by a single hair, with 1,000 deaths flying around him. Believe me, I thought not of myself." Washington could have been killed many times in the American Revolution. He would go into these battles. He could have been killed in Brooklyn, and again here at this battle, and even up to the very end. He could have been killed at the final battle. And so this shows how brave he was, and the fact that he wasn't killed, I think, shows that God was keeping him alive to play this very important role in getting our country started. So the Army spent the winter in early 77 in Morristown, New Jersey. There were 3,000 soldiers, and they were starving and freezing. So hard times throughout the war, very hard times. We can't imagine how hard. The guys who fought in Vietnam and they probably now feel bad, think they're not getting enough support. Well, you know, I think the Army, the soldiers who were least supported were the guys who brought freedom to this country, independence to the American people. During that winter, many of the soldiers were inoculated for smallpox because there was a plague, and Washington believed it supported inoculation. Now, it was very crude what they did. They would take people who had smallpox and scrape the pustules, which were like pimples, off of them, and or maybe the dead bodies, I guess if it was too painful, and they would mash that all up in a bowl, and then the person who was being inoculated, they would cut his arm with a knife, and they put a string through this pus in the bowl to get it, you know, wet with the smallpox virus. They put that string in the wound. They get it and they put it in the wound of the person, and introduce the smallpox virus into the person's body to be inoculated. And if they survived that, you know, they would get sick. But hopefully they would, and actually it was effective. Some guys died, but in general it worked, and it helped, because otherwise the smallpox plague was killing a lot of people. In June of 77, the Continental Congress passed a resolution creating the American flag on June 14th, with 13 stripes alternating red and white, and a blue upper left field with 13 white stars. On July 2 of 77, Fort Ticonderoga fell to the British. They retook it. The summer of 77 was pretty bad, or late summer. The British defeated the Americans at Brandywine Creek and took 1,200. There were 1,200 American casualties, killed, wounded, or captured. And Philadelphia was taken by the British, and that was our capital, Philadelphia. So that was pretty bad. And the Continental Congress, you know, they almost got caught. They left I believe in the night and fled so they wouldn't be captured, and the capital moved to York, Pennsylvania. However, one thing to remember is throughout the war, power was held in, really the real political power was in the 13 state capitals. So Washington was appealing to the Congress for things he needed, and also to each of the states. In October, the Battle of Germantown, Pennsylvania was another defeat, more than 1,100 American casualties. Washington wrote, quote, "The enemy are not proof against a vigorous attack, and may be put to flight when boldly pushed. A superintending providence is ordering everything for the best, and in due time all will be well." So he kept his positive attitude. Now there was a victory in October for the Americans. Horatio Gates and the U.S. Army defeated the British at Saratoga, New York, and the British general was Gentleman Johnny Burgoyne. There were 5,000 British troops who surrendered. This was a very big victory, and it was a major factor in leading France to decide to join the war on the American side. However, Benedict Arnold actually was the real hero in that battle, but Gates took the credit, and this led to Benedict Arnold's embitterment and later his betrayal of the American cause. After Gates' victory, there was a movement, political conniving, to replace Washington with Gates. And it didn't happen, but that was a headache. And Thomas Conway was an American general who was involved in that, in promoting Gates. The next winter, that would be 77-78, was spent outside of Philadelphia at Valley Forge, and this was the famous winter at Valley Forge. During that winter, in Valley Forge, Pennsylvania, 1/3 of the Continental Army did not have shoes. Hard to believe. There were 12,000 soldiers in the U.S. Army, and they were suffering from starvation and cold. So it was tough. It was very, very tough. Martha came again and helped raise morale at Valley Forge. Same problems Washington faced: short enlistments, desertion, shortages of food, clothing, and ammunition. And Washington had this to say: he wrote this at Valley Forge, quote, "The want of clothing added to the misery of the season has occasioned the soldiers to suffer such hardships as will not be credited but by those who have been spectators." Thomas Fleming, who's a modern historian, wrote this, "The righteous men from New England and their followers seemed ready to lose the war if they could not force public virtue down American throats." Now what he meant here is that the Continental Congress really didn't have the authority to tax or to raise, to get supplies. The states, it was up to them whether they wanted to or not. And there was the idea of, well, the Continental Army, these guys should just fight because it's the right thing to do, you know, and it's too bad if they're not being paid or if they're starving. But you know, they were really reluctant. The states were reluctant to tax their own people to get the needed supplies and resources to fight the war because they thought there would be rebellion against them. And we almost lost the war because of it. The Continental Congress was so incompetent that there were 3,249 committees. In fact, there were so many, there was a committee on committees. At Wilmington, Delaware in 77, that town was full of loyalists. And again, you know, the American troops were short on clothes. Often during battles, they would take, if they won a battle, they would take uniforms from the British. So this American brigade arrived in Wilmington, and a lot of them were wearing red coats, the British uniform. So the people assumed it was a British contingent. So they started singing "God Save the King." And they said, "We have good mutton, fine, fat hogs for sale." Well, those people were arrested for that, and the food was confiscated that they were trying to sell. Now, the hard times that took place at Valley Forge were severe. And there's a very good account by one of the soldiers who was there named Albigence Waldo, and he said this, quote, "The army, which has been surprisingly healthy hitherto, now begins to grow sickly from the continued fatigues they have suffered this campaign. I am sick, discontented, and out of humor. Poor food, hard lodging, cold weather, fatigue, nasty clothes, nasty cookery, vomit half my time, smoked out of my senses, the devil's in it. I can't endure it. Why are we sent here to starve and freeze? What sweet felicities have I left at home? A charming wife, pretty children, good beds, good food, good cooking, all agreeable, all harmonious. Here all confusion, smoke and cold, hunger and filthiness, a pox on my bad luck. There comes a bowl of beef soup, full of burnt leaves and dirt, sickish enough to make a Hector spew. Away with it, boys. I'll live like a chameleon upon air. There comes a soldier. His bare feet are seen through his worn-out shoes, his legs nearly naked from the tattered remains of an only pair of stockings, his breeches not sufficient to cover his nakedness, his shirt hanging on strings, his hair disheveled, his face meager. His whole appearance pictures a person forsaken and discouraged. He comes and cries with an air of wretchedness and despair, I am sick. My feet lame, my legs sore, my constitution broken. I fail fast, I shall soon be no more. Tough times, tremendous suffering. These were the men who helped give us our freedom. We should remember them. At Valley Forge, 2,500 American troops died of cold, starvation, and disease. God bless them all. But those who survived Valley Forge became stronger. The Army survived. George Washington wrote that thanks were, quote, due to the great author of all the care and good that have been extended in relieving us in difficulties and distress. So we're out of time. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time. God bless you. Take care. All this stuff. I had a lot more. Anyway, that's okay. Okay, Tim. Oops.